There are some bosses in video games who just look threatening, who give off an aura of danger the moment you lay eyes on them. But then there are some that you look at and go, this'll be easy. Maybe the character you're playing as is just too powerful or has become too powerful, and you find it hard to believe that they'll lose to this boss. Maybe the boss standing in front of you has been built up in context of the narrative as someone you're not supposed to think much of. Or maybe you just judge a book by its cover and the boss simply looks unassuming. Sometimes these assumptions are correct, but sometimes they're not. In this feature, we're going to take a look at 15 bosses in video games that, for some reason or another, we thought would be absolute cakewalks, but turned out to be truly formidable foes. Do note, there are spoilers ahead for every game that we talk about, so if you see us beginning to talk about a game that you do not want spoiled, skip ahead to the next entry. The Stranger, God of War. Kratos is a man who's killed everything that can be killed. He's killed hydras and krakens and gigantic minotaurs. He's killed the Colossus of Rhodes and the mythical Medusa. He's even killed Kronos, a character so big the screen could literally not fit his entire body. And Kratos looked like little more than a pixel in comparison. There isn't much or anything that you look at and think to yourself, maybe Kratos will have trouble killing this thing or person. Especially not when, at the beginning of God of War 2018, this lanky dude walks up to Kratos' front door and then proceeds to hurl insults at him, provoke him, hit him, threaten him, and his son. All the while you're thinking, this dude is asking for trouble. Kratos is going to turn him inside out and wear him like a coat. And then the stranger turns out to be more than just a thorn in Kratos' side. Psycho Mantis, Metal Gear Solid. When you first meet Psycho Mantis in Metal Gear Solid, you're certainly at the very least curious about what this thing is. Meryl's acting strangely, the game's background music is changing, and you've gotten enough signs from the change in the game's atmosphere to know that whatever is coming up, it's different. Psycho Mantis, though, does not have a very foreboding visual design, and you don't expect him to be a very tough boss fight, at least not when you first met him in 1998 without the knowledge of all the context that we have now. You certainly don't expect him to read your mind, make your controller vibrate, dodge every one of your attacks, and just flat out be one of the toughest bosses in the entire game. WHEATLEY, Portal 2. The slimy, traitorous bot known as WHEATLEY is surprising enough as it is, especially when you're playing Portal 2 for the very first time. He starts out as a hilarious companion character, looks like a ball, and is in the same game as GLaDOS. 3 reasons that when taken together are more than enough to convince you that WHEATLEY is never going to be a boss, and even if he is, he won't be a very threatening one. And sure, the fight against WHEATLEY isn't going to win any awards for being challenging, but he still proves to be much more formidable than you might have given him credit for at the beginning of the game. EMIL, NIER Automata. EMIL is essentially a disembodied, perfectly round head whose body is a heavily modified scooter. You don't look at it and think, wow, this will be a tough fight, especially considering the fact that NIER Automata isn't exactly a tough game to begin with. Like with all things Yoko Taro though, the fight against EMIL is all about escalation. That little head turns into an unbelievably massive head, and that unbelievably massive head has even more massive heads backing it up. That description, though, obviously doesn't do justice to the fight against EMIL and the scale it exhibits. You truly have to see it to believe it. The Twins, Persona 5. Persona is a series where you know that every boss battle is going to challenge you to some extent, at the least if you're not playing on easier difficulties. There's also the fact that boss fights against Velvet Room assistants in Persona are never quite easy. So while you don't exactly expect the fight against the twins to be a cakewalk, you are still caught off guard by just how challenging it is. The fight against the twins in Persona 5 is one of the toughest encounters in the entire game, and the fact that this is also the first time an all-out attack can be used against you makes the challenge even more surprising. WHITNEY, Pokemon Gold and Silver. When you run into Gym Leader WHITNEY in Pokemon Gold and Silver and discover that she's actually a sniveling little kid, you don't expect her to put up much of a fight. The fight that follows is surprisingly tough, most of which is down to just one of her Pokemon. Gehrman, Bloodborne. Gehrman is a man who sits in a wheelchair for almost the entirety of the game and is the protector of the sanctuary in the Hunter's Dream, the one place in all of Bloodborne that is sacred and devoid of any sort of physical danger. On top of that, he's the closest a character in a game like Bloodborne can come to being a kind mentor figure. Not only does he turn out to be one of the game's final boss encounters, possibly, he also turns out to be one of the toughest. DIRGE, Shadow of the Colossus. If you've played Shadow of the Colossus, it's likely that you have one of two very extreme opinions about Dirge, the 10th Colossus. You either love it or you hate it. Either way, you probably do not expect it to be a very tough encounter, because while every Colossus in the game is a huge mountainous figure, the actual act of taking them out is more a matter of finding the right strategy and then executing it, and is rarely ever challenging in and of itself. With Dirge though, you're being chased around by a massive snake that can slither its way underground, and gives you a very short window of opportunity to shoot it in its weak spot while you're galloping away from it on horseback. Sure, a lot of the challenge might have to do with the fact that the game's controls seems to be at odds with what it wants you to do, but it's still a challenge you do not expect. Master Hand, Super Smash Bros. There's a very good reason why you don't expect much from the Master Hand in any of the Super Smash Bros. Games as far as being a challenging boss fight goes. So what is that reason? Well, it's a hand. Sure, it's an abnormally big hand, but it's still just a hand. And sure, fights against the Master Hand aren't ever gruelingly tough or anything, but they still have the capacity to be challenging. Way more challenging than a fight against a literal freaking hand should be. The Suspicious Beggar, Bloodborne. You don't really expect any boss fight in a game like Bloodborne to be easy, but the Suspicious Beggar catches you off guard because, well, for the longest time you don't expect that you'll ever have to fight him. That, combined with the fact that he goes from being a lanky, weak-looking fellow with bandages wrapped around his head to becoming a huge, hulking, nightmare fuel-looking monstrosity, means that you can't help but underestimate him and what he's capable of when you first meet him. Marguerite Baker, Resident Evil 7. The final boss against Evelyn in Resident Evil 7 may have been a sourly disappointing affair, but every fight against members of the Baker family that led up to it was an absolute blast. The one that stands out the most has to be against Marguerite, the mother of the horrifying family. Given the tone of the game, it's hard to underestimate any boss fight in Resident Evil 7, but Marguerite reveals some truly surprising abilities. Not only does she turn into a disgusting spider-like monstrosity that can crawl circles around you with surprising agility, she can also summon an army of repulsive insects that will give you nightmares for days. Restless Night, Dragon Quest XI. Dragon Quest XI is an excellent game for many reasons, but one of the few things that it has been criticized for is that it's a bit too easy. The boss fights in the game especially are surprisingly devoid of challenge and fail to have any real stakes, and often these fights themselves don't live up to the build-up to them, or even the visual design of some of the bosses. The fight against the Restless Night comes about halfway through the game, by which time you're expecting every boss encounter to be a cakewalk. And while the Restless Night isn't a gruelingly tough encounter, it's by no means a cakewalk. It has a repertoire of nasty attacks that can easily inhibit some of the abilities you need most, and is definitely one of the hardest boss fights in the entire game, though I do realize that's not really saying much. Viper, Titanfall 2. We know what you're thinking here. It's a huge mech suit that can fly and shoot guns and missiles. How do you underestimate something like that? And well, we hear you, except when you fight Viper in Titanfall 2, you're also in a huge mech suit that can shoot guns and missiles. Viper, though, turns out to be surprisingly agile and has an arsenal of attacks that are not all too easy to dodge and can deal devastating amounts of damage. Then there's the fact that you don't really expect a game like Titanfall 2 to have tough boss fights at all. Cynthia, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl. Bosses against Elite Four champions in Pokemon games are never easy, but the fight against Cynthia is arguably the hardest of them. Where previous Elite Four champions, with the exception of Blue, all had one type of Pokemon, Cynthia is a multi-type trainer. Lance is a Dragon type, Steven is a Steel type, Wallace is a Water type. Cynthia? Well, she has Pokemon that ranges across multiple types, which means you need to have a good, balanced, well-trained team. She has a strong, balanced lineup of Pokemon that are all quite leveled, and make use of some hard-hitting strategies that are unlike anything the game has thrown your way until then. Thunderblight Ganon, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. The Legend of Zelda as a series is known for having excellent boss design, and Breath of the Wild, for all its excellence, seriously falters in that one area. The bosses in this game are disappointing to say the least, with not much to make them stand out in any way, and encounters against them being surprisingly easy. The fight against Thunderblight Ganon, though, is a breath of fresh air. Thunderblight Ganon is a surprisingly agile, mean-looking beast. Its fast movement makes sure that landing hits on it is no easy task, while its own attacks can do a fair bit of damage. Sure, it's still far from being the toughest boss fight in the series, but compared to every other set-piece encounter in Breath of the Wild, it's quite challenging. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.